forget to hit the record button. So yeah, Shaun, please.
Okay. Thank you, Tobias, and thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I just want to check. I am, you can hear me, right? Yes. So the title is Scaling Up or Scaling Out, and I will give you something about a line. The first three sections here are really about the nature of the kind of explanation I'm looking for. So I'll talk about integrative accounts, meshed architecture, and then a kind of the idea of a dynamical explanation. So those first three parts are really methodological in a sense. And then what I'm going to try to do is to apply all of this to the case of autistic spectrum disorder as a kind of case study. And then I'll come back at the very end to the kind of questions that we've been wrestling with about representation and about scaling up. Okay. So I want to start by talking about these this notion of integrative accounts, and note that integrative accounts of psychiatric disorders can be either narrow or wide. And I think, for example, Philip Gerrans in his book in 2014, this is The Measure of Madness, he says, basically, he's looking for an integrative account. So he uses that phrase. And he's talking about a kind of interdisciplinary integration in order, he says, to explain how the mind configures itself in response to incoming information. Okay. What he's trying to integrate are conceptions of the neural architecture. And specifically, he's looking at the default mode network, which he says is generating a kind of narrative, or again, he calls it a default delusional kind of thinking. He's looking specifically at delusions here. And all of this in response to anomalous experience or phenomenology. So I think in some sense, he proposes a relatively standard internal hierarchy of levels arranged on a kind of vertical axis. The disciplines he's trying to integrate include cognitive neuroscience, phenomenology, and some sort of cognitive theory about narrative. And then in terms of what happens in a delusion, it's the idea that something goes wrong with subpersonal mechanism, some kind of neural process is disrupted, causing some form of anomalous experience, and then motivating some kind of reflective thought or delusional thought, or what he calls default thought, which is tied to some kind of malfunction in the default mode. So what he has in mind is, Andy Young's work on Capgras syndrome, where the fusiform face area, something happens there, some kind of neural disruption causes me to have a weird, anomalous experience of the other person's face, which then generates in some way a kind of delusional response, which is to think that that person is an imposter or a robot or something like that. So in his book, Gerrans pursues an explanation in terms of causal relevance using Woodward's interventionist notion of causality. And he also makes reference to Craver's concept of mutual manipulability in Craver's work on the new mechanisms. And although he provides a mainly bottom-up approach that calls on neural network theory, for example, he also invokes hierarchical arrangements of top-down predictive processing and he treats the entire cognitive system as an information processing one. So he's combining, he's integrating a number of these different models, we might say. And one challenge for his integrative account is precisely how to integrate these different models, all of which depend on the concept of different levels. And with respect to levels, this is what he says. He says the notion of levels is ubiquitous, but not everyone uses it in the same way. It can refer to ordering relationships between theories, or the objects of theories ordered by size or complexity. So for example, cells are smaller and less complex than the organs they make up. It can refer to functional analyses. For example, vision is a higher level property than edge detection, or levels of mereological containment. So for example, parts are at a lower level than wholes. These uses, he says, can overlap, and in his analysis, they seem to overlap quite a bit. But he says that the notion of level relevant to his own analysis is that of mechanism. Higher levels correspond to the organization of components, and lower levels to the components themselves. Louis Sas has, I think, a wider conception of integration. So in a number of recent papers, Sas, especially this 2018 paper, outlines what he calls a bio-pheno-social integrative account, where the bio means genetics and neural processes, and the explanation at that level has to be integrated in some way with phenomenology. But he also wants to bring in social factors and ask, what role do social factors play? And then he starts to worry about how to explain the relations among the various component processes. Should we think of them as hierarchical? Should we think of them as merely causal, or are they constitutive? And we know that type of debate that we can get into. And he ends up saying this, that these questions pertain to theoretical issues that are difficult or even impossible to settle, such as overall attitudes towards holistic explanation, or the enigmatic mind-body problem, generally viewed as utterly insoluble. So the question for him and for a number of people is exactly how do we integrate social cultural factors into the kind of level account of cognitive experience. So for example, should we put the social and the cultural sort of top down at having an effect upon the cognitive and the narrative conceptions? And so for example, Shinobu Kitayama suggests something like this. He thinks culture is a kind of package of propositional constructs, values, beliefs, worldviews, and that really we have to think of culture as sort of external and then top down vis-a-vis the cognitive system. It's possible, though, perhaps, to think that culture can reach down into our pre-reflective consciousness, our ordinary experience of the world, let's say. And if we think of this question in terms of whether it has an effect upon the minimal self or minimal pre-reflective self-awareness, then there's a debate. And in the debate, someone like Dan Zahavi says, no, the social, the cultural doesn't really permeate the pre-reflective level. On the other hand, there's a number of people who argue, well, yes, it does. So Matthew Ratcliffe, Marian Cusello, Anna Shanaka, and Katrina Fotopoulos all suggest that the social really has a kind of deep effect upon our everyday experience, and even reaching into the minimal self and our minimal experiential processes. Well, another question would be, does it actually reach down into subpersonal mechanisms and have an effect upon genes and neurons? Well, there's a lot of work that could be cited here, but I really like the work of Arthur Glenberg and Tamer Solomon, who show through experiments that, in fact, social cultural factors are not top down. They're in fact, they permeate all aspects of the system, including, for example, body schematic processes, neuronal processes. And I think there's something important here to consider. Perhaps I think Andy Clark has suggested something similar to this when he says, we must confront the ever-active predictive brain in its proper setting, inextricably intertwined with an empowering backdrop of material, linguistic, and social-cultural scaffolding. Well, we might even think that there is a wider integration to be considered. I say wide or wild integration. If we start to add more elements to Sass's bio-pheno-social model, then it makes his challenge, where he says, these questions are difficult or even impossible to settle or utterly insoluble, makes that kind of challenge even more challenging. So here I'm thinking about all the different E's, the 4 E's and more E's: embodied, embedded, ecological, extended and active, emotional, affective processes that have to be in some way considered or integrated. So the 4E approach, I think, tells us about multiple elements that include cognitive, bodily, affective, artifactual and ecological factors, intersubjective and social and cultural and even normative factors that we have to consider. That is a motley collection, a heterogeneous conglomeration of factors that may constrain or enable or constitute a particular order or disorder of the mind. So here we're talking about a very holistic approach. Might drive Richard mad, but we'll come back to that in question and answer. Well, if we stay with either a kind of mechanist account or predictive processing or some kind of combination, as Gerens proposes, the challenge is then to say how all of these heterogeneous factors fit into a hierarchy of levels and how they all integrate. How do we get all these things on the left side into the system in the right way? And how do we manage to be able to deal with a more holistic explanation? Here I want to propose the model of a meshed architecture. And in this respect, I have to say that Julian's talk yesterday and Adrian's the day before, if I have that right, where they talked about skilled intentionality and grip, I think that comes in here. And we can think of that in the background. And actually, Phil Gerens gives us a clue in his book. In discussing the loss of a sense of agency in some schizophrenic delusions, he makes reference to studies of expert performance, where on some views, expert performance involves the absence of a sense of agency, as one is, in a sense, on automatic pilot or in the flow of performance. Compared, he says, to a stronger sense of agency in novice performance, where there is more top-down cognitive control. And so he says, we are more aware of our agency when learning a musical instrument, for example, than when performing a task automatically or successfully. So I think it's interesting that he suddenly points to questions that really have to do with performance and that are discussed in performance studies as he's trying to deal with questions having to do with schizophrenic delusions. And I think that although you might say, given what Gerens proposes, that he's endorsing a view similar to the view of Hubert Dreyfus, where Dreyfus thinks that expert performance as a kind of embodied coping, as kind of getting a grip on the world in the sense of Merleau-Ponty, is really a kind of mindless, and he would say definitely non-representational, being in the flow. We don't need to have reflection or cognition enter in to such processes. And in fact, Dreyfus says, to the extent that they do enter in, they would disrupt expert performance. Now, I think, however, when we look at the rest of what Gerens is saying, his analysis really puts him closer to a set of other theorists who argue that performance does involve mindful elements and who conceive of a top-down process where low-order automatic processes of embodied coping are modulated by higher-order reflective, representational cognitive aspects. And here I'm thinking about people like Christensen, John Sutton, Richard Schusterman, Barbara Montero, who are all working in the area of performance and trying to understand performance. So Montero, who's a dancer, for example, in studies of dance performance, argues that optimal performance often coincides with reflective, thoughtful performance, where thoughtful means, she says, self-reflective thinking, planning, predicting, deliberation, attention to or monitoring of or conceptualizing of actions, control, motor control, having a sense of the self even, and perhaps acting for a reason. These things enter into performance as well, according to Montero. And I think John Sutton describes the general idea. He and his colleagues say, skill is not a matter of bypassing explicit thought to let habitual actions run entirely on their own, but of building and accessing flexible links between knowing and doing. The forms of thinking and remembering, which can in some circumstances reach in to animate the subtle kinesthetic mechanisms of skilled performance, must themselves be redescribed as active and dynamic. So this is where the model of a meshed architecture comes in. It's been proposed by Christensen, Sutton, and McElwain as a way to explain how these mindful top-down processes reach in to the automatic motor processes during performance. What they propose is what they call a hybrid view, according to which cognitive control reduces during skill learning as automatic control comes to play an increasing role. But cognitive control continues to make a substantial positive contribution even at advanced levels of skill. So we don't simply go into a mindless flow. We bring with us our cognitive abilities. So the idea of the mesh involves, they say, a broadly hierarchical division of control responsibilities, with cognitive control usually focused on strategic aspects of performance and automatic processes more concerned with implementation. So again, they say controlled and automatic processes are being closely integrated in skilled action, and cognitive control directly influences motor execution in many cases. They do talk about a kind of situated awareness at the pre-reflective level, but a lot of what they say has to do with more higher order cognitive processes, somehow or other monitoring, keeping track of where we are in the performance. There are, I think, however, different interpretations of this meshed architecture that are possible. So what I have proposed in a couple of papers that I've written with Somesh Varga, is something like a more complex conception of this meshed architecture, and specifically in three different aspects. The first having to do with the concept of intrinsic control. So the idea is that control is not entirely top-down, but rather on this kind of vertical axis, there are important bottom-up processes that in fact are not simply automatic. And the second idea is that there's not just this kind of vertical integration, but there's a kind of horizontal axis that integrates social, cultural, normative, ecological, and affordance-related factors. And the third idea is that affect or affective processes play a large role here, modulating the dynamics of integration on both vertical and horizontal axes. So I'm going to talk about each of these very briefly in turn. First, this whole question of automaticity. It's a central question, I think. Are the motor control body schematic processes that are discussed here fully automatic? And it depends to some extent what you mean by automatic, but if you mean that these processes are consistently the same or repetitive or unchanging or unadapting, then I think the answer has to be no. I think this answer goes in contrast to someone like Jason Stanley or Stanley and Williamson's idea that know-how or skill is really a kind of knowing that, a more of a cognitive sort of thinking enters in, and that motor control itself just remains automatic and, as Stanley says, perfectly general. But I think there's a lot of evidence that motor control is not automatic and perfectly general, but rather highly specific and modulated by task and environment. And if we think of this in terms of habit, habitual movement or behavior is not blind or repetitive or always the same. Adjustments are made, constantly being made, relative to the task, to the environment, to the position of my body vis-a-vis the various artifacts I might be dealing with, as well as to my intention, or the actual intention in action that I might be involving. Again, we can think of this in terms of habit, and here I would refer briefly to Merleau-Ponty's notion of intelligent habit, which is not automatic or repetitive, although it might be close to automatic or might be automatic in some respects. Intelligence, he would say, is built into the movement so that control is intrinsic. The agent, he says, acquires the power of responding with a certain type of solution to a certain form of situation. That's what happens when one has a habit, even a bad habit, like Merleau-Ponty here, smoking. John Dewey also, instead of blind automatic repetition, habit is an open and adaptive way in which the body learns to cope with familiar or unfamiliar situations. So Dewey says repetition is in no sense the essence of habit. The essence of habit is an acquired predisposition to ways or modes of response. So all of this is by way of saying that we should not think of these bottom-up processes as necessarily automatic. The role of affect, I think, also is important. Affect shapes our ability to cope with the surrounding world and works differently in different types of skilled actions. Affective processes directly shape body schematic motor control processes. So for example, slowing down or speeding up such processes, or leading to the adoption of certain initial postures that may influence the performance, or how the agent is functionally integrated with the world. So affect and body schematic processes are closely integrated, since part of the vertical mesh in expert performance, they're still part of that vertical mesh, but they are also such that they allow for a kind of integration attuned to targets and environmental features. And that takes us into the horizontal features in the performance situation. So on the horizontal axis, I want to include our relations with artifacts, instruments, established practices, other people, importantly. So we could think of this in terms of extended mind or distributed cognition, material engagement theory. There's a number of ways that we could talk about this type of horizontal integration. Neither body schematic nor affective processes, however, are isolated from the agent's environment. Rather, we have to think of them as being attuned to both stabilities and variations in environmental factors. Simon Hofting has this concept, which he calls interkinesthetic affectivity, where he's really thinking about social aspects involved in performance, and he's studying in some detail musical performance in groups. And he thinks that this affectivity and these body schematic processes are in fact very much influenced by the social. So ecological, normative, cultural, intersubjective aspects of the physical and social environment, right? These also include physical and social affordances, and all of these things, I think, play an important role in performance. So this, what I'm calling an enriched meshed architecture, is made more complex along both vertical and horizontal lines. And it serves to frame questions that can lead to, I think, a fuller explanation, not only of performance, where much of this discussion takes place, and performance studies, but also I think it helps us work out a sense of what it means to talk about situated cognition. And I think it can also be applied to social cognition. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But I think further explanation requires an account of dynamical relations that exist among all of these elements, right? So that we start to think of the mesh more as a dynamical gestalt of processes in which vertical and horizontal are clearly just explanatory abstractions. We're really dealing with a kind of dynamical system here. And on a dynamical view, or what I'm calling a dynamical gestalt view, it's not clear why we should think of neuronal processes as on a more basic or lower level than social processes, unless we've already made some reductionist assumptions, right? Because neural processes and social processes can be co-temporaneous across timescales, and they can involve reciprocal causal relations. In that case, it's not clear why one is more basic than the other, or we should think of them as operating on different levels. So in this view, we can give up the notions of levels and hierarchies, and we can still use interventionist analysis, the interventionist analysis of causal relevance. So For example, we can have an intervention on one of the aspects or one of the factors in this gestalt and ask what exactly happens with the rest. So an intervention on one factor may shift things around, perhaps bestowing more weight on other factors. And this can be more than just a wiggling of an internal mechanism, right? To use Craver's term wiggling here. So for example, there could be a drug effect on neuronal processes. It can be, I'll use a technical term here, it could be a smiggling where, for example, a social factor can be the intervention that can rearrange the entire gestalt. Some social events, some intersubjective encounter with another person, which itself might have some kind of implications for my affective life, can then rearrange other aspects within this gestalt. So clearly, using the model of a meshed architecture to map out the important variables and possible causal relevance is really only a first step. A second step, in order to explain the actual meshing of the very different types of factors and processes involved, that sort of motley collection of cognitive, affective, bodily, behavioral, ecological, social, cultural, normative factors. But one, I think, can still use this kind of interventionist model to experimentally test the dynamical integration, wiggling, smiggling, changing, adding, subtracting in experimental context to try to define more precisely relations that are, for example, enabling or constraining or that involve reciprocal causality. And I think we can get even more specific using dynamical systems models of what Scott Kelso calls coordination dynamics. And here, I just want to point to a very recent paper published a few weeks ago, but they've published a number of papers over the years on this notion of what they call coordination dynamics. And they're looking at social interaction, social cognition, and trying to understand it from a dynamical systems perspective. And they have specifically a kind of methodological approach to try to work out the dynamical systems idea along this line, so that there is some methodology here that I would point to. As Kelso puts it good number of years ago, he says, dynamics is a language for connecting events from the genetic to the mental. So this whole motley collection. And Kelso struggles in that 1995 book called Dynamical Patterns, struggles with the notion of levels and hierarchy. He still kind of maintains that, but he does make some interesting suggestions there about getting beyond that. Okay, now the last bit of this is an attempt to say something about how all of this applies to autistic spectrum disorder. And as Kelso himself suggests, in social cognition, the case of autism provides a testbed for an integrative approach. Can the model of meshed architecture or thinking in terms of a dynamical gestalt help to sort out some of the complexity involved in social cognition in the case of ASD? Right. So we could think, if we're looking specifically at autism, the kind of traditional approach, we might say, is one that focuses on the cognitive idea of theory of mind, and that there are theory of mind problems. So you might be familiar with Baron Cohen and lots of other people who have talked about that. And of course, that has to do with the level of cognition, but of course it also refers to something going wrong in neural processing, either mirror neurons not working properly or a theory of mind mechanism not quite right. So there have been approaches that sort of focus there, but there's also been some people, Peter Hobson is one person, for example, who really focuses on affectivity problems in autism. Affect, of course, as we said, shapes our everyday actions and our ability to interact effectively with others in social contexts. So if something goes wrong with our affective system, then we're going to get some kind of problem in social cognition from that. It's also possible to point to some even more recent and a growing body of research on sensory motor problems that can interfere with motor control and that can disrupt patterns in afferent and proprioceptive sensory feedback systems. Yeah, there's been a good deal of research showing that in autism, there are problems at the sensory motor level. So problems with motor coordination, postural instability, atypical gait, motor sequencing, anticipatory postural adjustments, expressionless faces, for example. As I say, a lot of people are talking about that. And the idea is that these kind of motor control processes and disruptions of those processes will generate a change in the affordance structure and also in communicative practices, specifically the ability of the autistic, the person with autism to have a conversation, to sustain a conversation, for example. And Victoria McGeer, I think, and a number of others have pointed out how important it is with respect to how others treat the person with autism, so that the social aspects here enter in and can, in fact, support support the disruption, it's not the right word, but reinforce, I suppose, the kind of disruptive processes that are going on rather than help. So if we think of various therapies as interventions, we can ask how an intervention on one process affects or realigns other processes. So for example, Tager, Fussberg, and Anderson studied conversational ability in children with ASD and suggested that impairment in conversational ability is due to deficits in theory of mind development. So Hadwin and colleagues tested this hypothesis. They trained children with ASD on tasks that employ theory of mind abilities in order to understand mental states in others, focusing on beliefs, emotion states, and pretense. So this kind of theory of mind training is a kind of intervention, a therapeutic intervention coming in to our cognitive abilities. Hadwin compared conversation abilities prior to training and post-training using 4 different categories. One, the simplest, is a simple answer. A child simply provides a one-word reply to a question and did not really further engage in the conversation. And then there are other levels of, where the child could develop the answer. There could be simply repetitive answers, or there could be simple unclear responses. And what they found was, after training on theory of mind tasks, the children did learn to pass tasks concerning emotional and belief understanding. However, as they put it, there was no corresponding advance in social communication skills, specifically no improvement in the development of conversation and no increase in the use of mental state terms in speech. All right. So the majority of children with autism remained in the answer category and did not improve. They were simply giving one-word answers to questions and did not really engage in conversation. So in this case, wiggling theory of mind, so to speak, doesn't affect conversational ability or improve social interaction, at least in this respect. So the question could be raised, would early intervention that improved motor coordination have any effect on social interaction? And with respect to this, there's no clear answer at this point, but there's some interesting hypotheses. So in a recent study, Kostrubiak and colleagues, who are referencing Kelso's coordination dynamics approach, compared 20 ASD children with 21 typically developing children between the ages of 8 and 14 concerning motor coordination in intentional motor tasks. And they looked at the correlation to the socio-adaptive quotient scores, a kind of test they gave them, that measure communication ability and socialization, where, how often they say please or thanks or excuse me and such. There was no notable differences in a simple perceptual motor coordination task between the two groups. But consistent with other studies, ASD children showed increasing deficits, specifically in more demanding interpersonal coordination tasks, when coordination patterns were intentionally requested by the experimenter. So when they're interacting with the experimenter, something starts to go wrong. And this correlates directly to poor SAQ scores. So improved performance in older ASD children suggests perhaps that therapeutic intervention would be possible. And this leads to an ambiguous hypothesis that Kostrubiak and colleagues propose. They say this leaves the hypothetical and to be tested possibility that by manipulating motor coordination parameters in ASD children, their coordination abnormalities could be reduced and their social deficits perhaps alleviated. I think it's more complicated than that, however. So increased deficits in coordination when socially interacting with the experimenter, plus other studies that show that in other disorders such as ADHD, anomalies in motor coordination don't lead to social deficits. I think these things suggest not a one-way causal relation, but some more nuanced relation between social interaction and motor coordination. The more general suggestion then is that such interventions may help to show reciprocal causal relevance, right? Intervening on body schematic motor processes may have an effect on social processes, but it might go the other way. It might be that the social encounter has an effect on body schematic processes. Here, I mean, it might be a case of mutual manipulability that is turning up a kind of reciprocal causality. Okay, so my conclusion, very quickly then, on this dynamical Gestalt view, which I think causes some trouble for both new mechanists and predictive processing views, I think one can first give up concepts of levels or hierarchy, in which case, I think the implication there is that the scaling up problem, in a sense, disappears, since there is no up or down. If we're dealing with this kind of integrated Gestalt, then it's not clear that there is a scaling up problem. But we can still use interventionist analysis to identify causal relevance, which gives us a way to sorting out the dynamical connections between the different factors. And thereby, we can provide a dynamical systems explanation in which there may be recursive or reciprocal processes, but as Scott Kelso had suggested quite a while ago, there would be no reference state with which feedback can be compared, and no place where comparison operations are performed. And I think if we consider that, that suggests there's no need for representations there in any explanatory sense. Okay, thank you very much.